Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Debt Collective Jubilee School series, the opening kickoff night on College for All, and what it takes to understand why we don't have free tuition, why so many of us are in massive debt, and what it would mean to both cancel the debt and win free college tuition now and in the future. So, my name is Jason. I am with Debt Collective. Hi, Philip. We're just getting started. Um, oh, Rock Chalk Jayhawk. Okay, now I got it. There we go. Um, so we're just getting started, and good timing. My name's Jason. I'm with the Debt Collective. I am also a professor in University of Westchester University, but I do research in political education with Debt Collective, and it's a real pleasure to have you with us here tonight for this call. We are going to spend some time, and I'm going to turn it over to Julia in a second here to do a little more introduction, but we're going to spend some time talking about some of the origins of the college financial debt crises. We're going to discuss what it would look like to have free public higher education in this country, what it would take to get to that point. But as people were coming in, I did ask people to, if they wanted to include in the chat any questions you have about student debt, about college tuition. It could be broad, they could be specific, they could be historical, they could be about the present moment. We want to hear from you. That's very important. A word about Jubilee School and what we're trying to do with this series, and then I'm going to turn it over to Julia to do an introduction, not only of herself, but also of Mark. So, Jubilee School is the online political education platform for Debt Collective. We've been doing Jubilee School sessions for, I think, 3 or 4 years. Jubilee, as a lot of you know, means debt abolition. And so that's the idea that we're here to study together to figure out what it would take to abolish debts. But not only to abolish debts, but to make sure that the system that produces those debts is also, we stop that, we negate that. And in a variety of ways, we can talk about what that would look like. So there's both this idea of like, what would it look like to abolish debt? But then what would it look like to also fight for the types of services, institutions, goods that we need in order to make sure that we aren't driven into the types of debt that we're forced to burden today? A couple words about tonight, and then I will also remind us about the series sessions to come. But about tonight, yeah, you were in Jubilee School 2019, Tiffany. That's right. We go back way back, so that's great. All right. You can see this is a casual call, folks. So we're going to be talking about like academic stuff, but this is also a time to like share ideas and be friends about it. So, um, one of the things we try to do at Jubilee School is to both share information, share knowledge in the following form. Mark, you'll see tonight, is going to provide a really good analysis. After Mark provides the analysis, we're going to have some time for people to ask questions, and Mark will field them. If other people on here want to field them as well, you can do that. After the analysis section, we'll move into a period where we talk about like tactics or Skillshare examples, where we talk about like how do we turn that analysis into action in order to win some of the things we're talking about, in order to cancel some of the debt that we want to cancel. And then after that, we'll have another general session, general moment where we can have question and dialogue. So the idea here is to share information, to engage in discussion, to talk about both analysis, but also talk about like what is to be done. At the end of the call, we'll have a call to action. So we're going to announce some things that you can do immediately. And from there, hopefully you'll join us for other sessions. So as we get to the end of this night's event, I will post the following or the next Jubilee School sessions because we're going to have one every 2 weeks from now until the end of the summer, and the lineup's fantastic. So hopefully you can tune into those. But in general, I just want to say we're trying to create this arc of learning where we're like getting some basic information, building up knowledge, building up skills, and ultimately the goal is build power. We have to build power. So the knowledge that we share here, we want to turn into power. And that means that we got to use this knowledge to organize. And we got to use this knowledge to get active. And so that's what we're trying to do. If at any moment you have questions, you can write in the chat, like I just did, the word stack. And this helps me keep track of like who wants to talk, who needs to talk, and we'll get to you as soon as we can. Sometimes I might miss like if you're raising your hand either on the screen or like in real life. So if you could post the word stack in the chat, that helps me keep track. But if there's nothing else to go over in terms of housekeeping, I'm going to turn it over to Julia, who's my co-conspirator on this project and a new and fantastic member to the Debt Collective. So, Julia, please introduce yourself and then introduce our guest tonight, Mark.
Hey everyone, so happy to be here. Can you hear me? I'm outside in sunny, beautiful LA, so sorry if you hear other noise as well. I saw Ron's in California too. My name's Julia. Like Jason said, I'm the higher ed director here at Debt Collective, and prior to being here, I was at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where I was the student loan ombudsman and worked was like the lead advisor to Director Chopra on student loan policy. So I learned a lot in that role, of course. And before that, I was at the Center for Responsible Lending, where I worked a lot on the campaign to cancel student debt. So I'm really glad to be here. I'm really excited about this Jubilee School. I don't know what people know about this Jubilee School, and I know we've had some technical difficulties today, so apologies for those. But we have sessions running through August of Jubilee School, and I'm extremely excited about them. We have academics presenting on, the areas they know most. We have policy people presenting on their work and the barriers to getting to winning things like College for All. We have next week, me and Jason, I'm excited about that, talking about how we got here. And the week after that, one of my heroes, Doha Meki, who was associate or I believe assistant deputy attorney general for in the antitrust division of the Department of Justice under the Biden administration, talking about tuition and college price fixing. So we just have an enormous amount of amazing sessions coming up in the next few months. So I hope you'll join us, and shout out to my dad, who's here, who's also former college professor. And one of my heroes that I've come across in the work is Mark. So Mark, thank you so much for being here on our kickoff session. You always act like that, but I think it's so well deserved and well earned. Mark is an amazing writer and policy fighter for College for All, but also for student basic needs access, um, like students who don't have enough food, don't have housing, don't have an ability to care for their children during college. So Mark knows so much, and you're probably not going to talk about this, Mark, but I really love a certain paper you wrote back in your Demos days that I think does talk about how we got here to this point. So maybe I'll find it and put it in the chat. But to give Mark a more formal introduction, besides my respect for him, I wanted to say that he is the director of policy and advocacy at the Hope Center for Student Basic Needs. That's a center at Temple University that also does what I see as the premier survey of students all over the country at universities and community colleges about basic needs. It's an amazing survey. We relied on it heavily at the CFPB. I rely on it heavily now. And he works on federal policy efforts to modernize higher ed and safety net policies to support students' basic needs and improve college affordability. And he's also a senior fellow at Protect Borrowers, our beloved friend organization, fighting to build an economy where debt does not limit opportunity. There's a little bit more about Mark on the page, and you can find out more about Mark by Googling him. But that's all for now. And Mark, thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand it over to you. And nice to meet you all. Thank you all so much for being here. See you again each time.
Thank you, Julia. Lord knows what's going to come up if y'all Google me. So please feel free. I take no responsibility. Julia, that was an unbelievably generous introduction, and I appreciate it, and so appreciate the work of the Debt Collective and what you're building, and Jason and Thomas and everyone else over there, Ashley and others who are just, you know, so deeply ingrained in the fights that I genuinely believe will win around making an actually truly public, affordable system of opportunity in this country. I don't even want to say higher ed, but just full system of opportunity. Just so grateful to be here. If you hear little ones creeping about, my children are about to be home soon, but we're gonna make it a family affair. Julie's dad's already here, so we might make it a multi-generational thing. Um, but in the meantime, I am going to share, like any good presenter on a sort of seminar type thing. I do have some slides that are going to guide my remarks tonight, but I do, to Jason's point, want to make this, super conversational and answer any questions and leave time for us to all learn from each other, because I think that sort of both from a substance and a tactical perspective, that's the only way we win, right? Is learning from each other. So hopefully I can do my part. And I'm going to share my slides if folks see it. We good? Cool. So I have the unenviable task tonight of obviously kicking off this series or being a part of the kickoff series. And I know that y'all are going to have an amazing set of speakers talking about higher ed governance and pricing and um, how what we combine with college for all and free college to make the system equitable and just, and we're investing in the right things, right? So I'm going to leave some of that to other speakers who are much more equipped to talk about that. But I do want to talk about in an era when, I think falsely some are maybe saying that, hey, the free college movement is, that's yesterday's thing. Or, the fight for debt cancellation is, that was last administration's thing. What are we doing next? I'm going to talk about why this still fundamentally matters to any notion of fairness, equity, economic justice, racial justice, frankly, and why we need to center it in a politics of affordability if we're going to win, right? If we're going to build the economy that we want. So to do that, I want to talk a little bit about the roots of what has been the modern free college movement. And this is oversimplified, but I see really three key areas where that sort of sparked, the modern movement for free college, which I think in many ways was incredibly successful over the past decade and a half, in no small part to a lot of the people on this call. But there are three sort of main areas that I like to focus on. One is, this movement is rooted in decades-long disinvestment or divestment in public higher education, right? The movement from what was really a public good shouldered by states and in some ways the federal government, to a shift, right? A shift to tuition, a tuition-based model, a shift to lower taxes and sort of it being difficult to fund public goods, a shift from the federal government from grant aid to a loan-based higher education system. None of that was inevitable. That was a series of choices, and it happened over a series of decades. The second thing that I like to focus on is the post Great Recession fights for economic justice, for racial justice, for affordability, fundamental questions about why people were being left behind in the economy. Free college and the fight for student debt cancellation were so central to that because it exposed the lie about what it meant to have opportunity and the American dream or lack thereof. And the last thing that I think sort of, sparked a lot of this movement is a story about corporate power and wage stagnation, and the fact that people who were doing everything right and, working to get employment and working to get training and education were doing it, but seeing their lifestyles sort of stagnate or even decline, right? That's all the sort of soup that was part of the free college movement, really starting in 2008, 2009, 2010, and certainly in the years thereafter. And I mention all of that to say that, you know, none of these things have shifted, right? But I want to go into each one a little bit individually, right? So the decades long divestment in public higher education. Please don't feel free, you need to memorize these numbers. I share these because I know we're recording and we're happy to share slides afterwards. But basically, over time, we've seen the share of college costs covered by state support, right? That's the public good piece of this, the amount that states are kicking in versus the amount of tuition that states are getting or institutions are getting fundamentally shift, right? So in 1980, the share of college costs that states were kicking in was about 80%, right? That kept prices low. They could get a little bit from tuition, but they could keep tuition relatively low. Over time, we've seen that dramatically shift so that it's close to half, or at least 40% of the amount that higher ed is funded is coming from tuition. And in fact, most states, 32 states, are currently funding public higher education at lower per student levels than they were at the beginning of this century, right? So not rocket science, right? You pull back state support from higher ed, it has to come from somewhere. States, tuition is often called the balance wheel, right? It's a release valve for folks or for college leaders or for states saying, well, we're going to cut higher ed here, but we can make it up on the backs of students and families, right? At the same time, the federal government, which, can fund students directly through things like the Pell Grant, the Pell Grant used to cover a tremendous portion of college costs. So if you were a low-income student receiving a Pell Grant, most of your tuition and frankly cost of attendance were covered. but we've seen that steadily decline, right? The purchasing power of the Pell Grant has declined considerably to the point where it covers only about a quarter of in-state public college costs today. So what fills in the gap? Student loans, right? And so again, I think of this as sort of a simple math problem. There's other reasons for the college cost crisis, but this is where most students attend in terms of public colleges. This is kind of the story. At the same time, you see entrenched wealth inequality in America, right? So the people who are most able to deal with this cost shift, the people who are most able to deal with the rising debt burden or potential debt burden are the people with resources in the first place, right? So I know again, it's maybe out of fashion these days, but I think talking about the racial wealth gap in this country is central to talking about why we need a fundamental rethink of how we finance opportunity in this country. The median white household, this is the most recent numbers from the Federal Reserve. The median white household has $284,000 in net worth, compared to $44,000 for the typical black household, right? That's a tremendous delta or difference when you're talking about, what that person or what that family can bring to bear when it comes to financing higher ed, right? This means that debt-free college is a reality for many, many, many people, but college is a debt sentence for the vast majority of people of color in this country. And what does it mean, right? That if you have the wealth to begin with and you maybe can attend college debt free or, have to take on minimal amounts of debt, student debt becomes a fundamentally different proposition for you. So, 12 years after starting school, this is a study that I did, several years ago now. We found that the typical white male borrower has paid off about 44% of their debt 12 years after starting. The typical Latina borrower has only paid off about 14% of their debt. And the typical black female borrower actually has 13% more debt than she started with 12 years after starting school, right? Student debt is just sticky for some borrowers as opposed to others, right? Paying off about half of your student debt about 12 years after starting school, it's not a good outcome, right? It's not something that I think should be foisted upon most people. It shouldn't be the bar that we set, but it's fundamentally different than having more debt than when you started, right? So I think that's the fundamental thing we need to talk about is this is very different for different populations. And again, if we are going to live up to our basic fundamental principles of equity, we need to address it for those for whom it's most sticky. The last thing, and I won't go too deeply onto this because I know that there will be other speakers talking about it, but I think that there's another piece of the free college conversation that needs to grapple with the fact that training and education in this country used to primarily and in some ways be shared by employers, right? Employers would invest in the training and the skill building of their workforce, right? They saw it as a worker retention strategy. They saw it as just the thing that you do, right? They have essentially offloaded that to the higher education system while paying workers less, right? So the consolidation of corporate power and the ability of folks in sort of C-suites or executive roles to pull back from the education and training of their workforce and forcing those folks to go to a debt finance system to gain the skills that they could have gained on the job has to be a piece of this puzzle, right? So I think part of this fight is about corporate power and what we're asking of employers. And if they're not going to do this, what we're asking them to fund and how we finance something like free college. So that's also a key piece of this, right? I bring all this up to say that every one of these dynamics remains relevant today and maybe is more important than ever. So, in terms of the divestment in public higher ed and a shift from grant aid to loans, I'm not going to go deeply into the law that Congress passed last year. We'll call the One Big Beautiful Bill Act or HR 1, or maybe some of you have much worse names for it than I'm going to name on this call because it's being recorded. Uh, that actually fundamentally shifted the federal state relationship in a number of programs. There is now a major looming cost shift and cost burden to state governments from many of the SNAP and Medicaid cuts in that bill. You may have seen big headlines about $1 trillion of cuts to SNAP and Medicaid, which is going to harm people and families, right, in terms of their ability to access basic food and healthcare. It's also going to create major burdens on state budgets. And when that happens, higher education tends to be the first thing cut. So when we talk about state public divestment in higher ed, what Congress just passed last year in this sort of gargantuan tax and spending bill is going to supercharge some of the dynamics that we've seen over the past several decades. In addition to leaving millions of families uninsured, in addition to leaving millions of families losing SNAP benefits, which is going to cause, their sort of the burdens that they face either while they're enrolled or saving for college, sort of untenable. There's also going to be, and again, we can talk a little about this, new restrictions on the ability to access federal aid in terms of federal loans, which are sort of often the least bad option for financing higher ed. There's restrictions on part-time students in terms of their access to federal loans. There's a massive shortfall now in the Pell Grant program that's going to have to be filled in. There's more expensive loan repayment. The Congress has now made, paying your loans more onerous relative to what the Biden administration had fought for. So all kinds of reasons why the divestment and the federal role in higher ed is actually, I believe, going to get worse before it gets better. The second piece of this about the sort of fights for affordability, the fights for, who has basic financial stability in this country. Again, we're in an era of incredibly high prices, right? Food prices, housing prices, automobiles and auto insurance, childcare prices that rival college tuition or actually exceed college tuition in most states. Rent prices going up in across the country, right? These are the things that both prevent families from putting money away for higher ed, but also harm students while they're enrolled. Non-tuition costs make up the vast majority of the cost of going to college. We can talk a little bit about this and how we design free college, but the vast majority of the cost of, say, community college is housing costs, right? And so if those costs are going up and up and up for families, that's going to exacerbate the student debt crisis. We at the Hope Center, Julia mentioned our survey of student basic needs. We find that 3 in 5 students in this country are experiencing basic needs insecurity related to food and or housing. And in fact, 14% are homeless, experiencing homelessness while they're enrolled in school. That is a crisis that has been consistent. That's not a post-COVID thing. That's not just a, that has been consistent, across many, 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 many years. And obviously that impacts the ability of students themselves to succeed, but it also reflects on how high and out of control prices are in this country and our inability to address both sort of tuition costs, but also non-tuition costs as well. And the last thing I'll say is that on sort of the wage stagnation and corporate power piece, there's been a fundamental shift, and I think this is a super untold story in the higher ed conversation. But we hear all the time about the college wage premium, right? You go to college, you get more, you get more earning power. You should be able to pay off your debt. And it was true for a long time that unemployment rates for recent college grads were actually, lower than those for all workers, right? If you graduated college, you were more likely to be employed. That actually has shifted over the past few years, where the unemployment rate for recent college grads is now actually higher than the overall unemployment rate in the economy. Again, you don't need to sort of like have your eyes glazed over at this graph, but I want to say that the labor market for recent college graduates is shifting to a point where it is now precarious for recent college grads. Now, long term, we want more people to get education. We want more people to go to college. We want people to follow their dreams and get the skills and training they need. But it is just simply not true that your insurance policy of a college degree is serving people right out of school, right? So we need to really fundamentally grapple with that. Meanwhile, median wages for those who have a bachelor's degree are effectively the same as they were in 1990, adjusted for inflation, right? So people, again, it's better for you long term in your economic outcomes and your happiness and all kinds of non-financial measures we don't talk about enough, and social, all kinds of social goods to have a more educated populace, the impact on democracy. But it is also just true that wages are stagnating for most people across the country. So when prices go up and debt go up, and wages stagnate, that's a recipe for disaster. So I'd like to say, and again, we don't need to belabor all of this, but free and debt-free college presents a way out of this knot. We know that states, in the absence of a federal plan, states have begun to have dozens of programs crop up throughout the country. We can talk about these. We know that in sort of some red states, Tennessee has expanded a pretty robust free community college program under Republican governors and Republican legislatures. New Mexico has now financed the most comprehensive tuition-free college program in the country for both 2 and 4 year students. They basically have a program that wipes away tuition for all New Mexico residents entering public colleges, allowing students to use Pell Grants for those rising non-tuition costs. States like Washington have a different, little bit of a different flavor. They have sort of generous state financial aid programs that sort of like walk and quack a little bit like free college. But we've seen states say, look, the federal government has not stepped up to the plate on this. We've come close, right? We've come close to uh, having some form of a federal state program for free college, but we haven't gotten there yet, and we're certainly not getting under there under this administration. So let's do things that we know are going to be good for our states. Let's invest in our states. Um, we know that there's some good evidence that they're effective, right? They increase college enrollment. There's lower student debt for students in these states entering these programs. There's some evidence on higher college attainment. Like I said, in some states, they're allowing Pell Grants to sort of go towards living costs and other expenses, which are sort of rising again along with tuition. And, for those who are competitive, New Mexico has seen higher college enrollment, growth than other states across the country because they made it free. Limited so far. We're sort of continuing to sift through the evidence, but it's good so far, right? And colleges, individual schools have done the same thing. But states are limited in what they can do, right? States have limited budgets. They have sort of economic headwinds that they often have trouble, navigating, especially if they're sort of regional or localized economic headwinds. So often, state free college programs are limited. They can be enrolled. They can be limited by, sector, just community college students. They can be only open to students attending full time or means tested in some way. Students only graduating recently from high school may be eligible. They might have to maintain a GPA requirement. Sometimes it's only available to students by major, right? For some colleges or state programs. My favorite, or rather least favorite one, is a New York requirement and their what's called their Excelsior Scholarship, which is students have to commit to staying in state after school, or else it becomes a loan, which is a fairly ridiculous policy to have. But states are often trying to figure out ways to constrain their programs. So that's, I think, again, we like to see states stepping up. There's a lot of advocacy opportunities for those folks who are in states who don't have sort of, really, really robust free college programs at the moment. But we need a federal role. And the federal role is going to come in some form through Congress. There are a couple models on the table. I know that a lot of folks here have done a lot of advocacy, myself included, around the College for All Act, which would provide a tuition-free guarantee for families, married couples up to $300,000 and single families making up to $150,000 a year. There's something called the Debt-Free College Act, which is somewhat similar, but is trying to meet people's unmet need, kind of the difference between what they get right now in grant aid and what's left over in non-tuition costs. There's something called the America's College Promise Act, which is basically college for all, but for just
Mm.
community college. There's several different flavors, and there doesn't have to be just these, right? We can advocate for better models or new bills, or other plans or sort of tweaks to these as we go. But there is appetite still in Congress for doing something big, that would be a federal program that would fund states that to actually augment the programs that they have, and continue them. But we need to do it, right? And we need to we don't need to wait for our governing moment to sort of bug Congress to do the right thing here. So um, I think the last thing I'll say, we can talk about any of these pieces, and I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I think in terms of meeting the moment, right? We're entering an election year, right? I'll say this with my sort of 501(c)(3 hat on as much as possible, but I think that there's something clear that the politics of affordability is going to animate our national politics moving forward. I think that, as I mentioned, none of the problems that led to a massive grassroots movement around student debt cancellation, around trying to do college for all, none of those problems have gone away, and in fact are more acute than ever. Um, I think making sure we're embedding higher ed and public higher ed in the same fight as the fight for housing, utility costs, healthcare costs, childcare costs, not because it's just this, not just because it's sort of the same political fight, but because these are in part the costs that are increasing student debt, right? These are the costs that students are facing that force them into long work hours or loans when they're enrolled in school. It's also, I think as we're sort of reorienting ourselves around what debt cancellation looks like and the fight for student debt relief looks like, both in this Congress and sort of post Supreme Court decision a few years ago, I think it's more clear than ever than having a really clear and hard line that says we are going to make sure we do the mea culpa of student debt, that we finish what we started on student debt, and we're going to make sure we structurally make it so that problem never happens again, has to be a part of the equation, right? And I think it offers a much better alternative, right? This administration and this Congress has not only relentlessly attacked public higher education and higher education, generally, but they've also decided that their solution is just untethering market forces, right? Capping loans so people can just go on the private market to afford their college, and if they're not a good bet, they don't get to go to school, or unleashing sort of for-profit short-term programs on people, is not a particularly popular or substantively good move. What is popular is public education, right? This, the last time I did polling on this, which is, admittedly a few years ago, we found that when you tap into families' intrinsic almost patriotism, right? Around things like the movement to make higher ed free through the GI Bill, right? In the movement to make public higher education exist at all, right? The creation of community colleges. People really respond to that, right? Especially in a way that people don't respond to the fact that, we're just going to make it so that you have to go to a bank, right? I think like the politics of this, when done well, is really powerful. And I think it's again good reminding ourselves in these times which are just caked in darkness, that things like this are still popular and essential to rebuilding public support for higher ed, right? I think free college needs to be a piece of this. We've done a few sort of, a little bit of public opinion and a few studies showing that the majority of voters say that, tuition-free college would actually increase the likelihood that they go or pursue education and training. Again, not rocket science, but it is something that we, need to hammer home as much as possible. And those who don't have to deal with debt, right? Those who have had their loans forgiven or canceled, will say more likely, hey, college was worth it for me. It put me on a pathway to success in my life. I think about it fondly versus those who are still in repayment. So again, it's essential to sort of economic justice, but it's also essential to the political question here. And I think we need to sort of think about those things hand in hand. With that, I know that was a lot. I'm happy to stop sharing my slides, and I know Jason, you have sort of a way to continue us in this conversation and talk about tactics and substance and questions and anything therein. So happy to be a part of this with you all.
First off, incredible presentation. Thank you, Mark, so much. Really appreciate that. So much information, so much knowledge that we need to understand the moment we're in and perhaps where we can go. So thank you for that. And lots of stuff I want to follow up on. Remember that there will be an archive of this and we can send out links afterwards as well. So thank you, Mark, for that. We just heard a lot, and let's take a moment here to pause and see if we have any questions. Really encourage questions more so than comments, but comments are also welcome too. So if you have a question or a comment, there's a couple ways to go about this. You can raise your hand as Julie and Michael have. You can also write the word stack in the chat. If you are shy and don't want to speak your question, you can type your question and or comment in the chat as well. But let's take a few moments to talk about what we heard. And from there, we'll move into a section where we talk about what it would mean to actualize some of this analysis to get some things done. So we'll take, I don't know, 5, 10 minutes to have a little Q&A, and then we'll keep going with tactics and skills and putting this into work, and then we'll open it up again. So I'm gonna go in the order that I saw people. Uh, Remember that there's going to be many people that want to speak, hopefully. So if you could keep your comment or question relatively short, that'd be great. I see Michael and I see Julia. So Michael, go for it.
Thank you, Mark, for the presentation. It was very informative and it was very visual. I didn't know that public funding in 2012 was still 59%. I thought it was like much lower than that, at least 34 to 40%. Because I know states have been cutting funding for higher education in the last 46 years. But anyways, I just want anyways, I'm going to pivot. So my question is this. I know you mentioned the three bills that are being introduced in Congress to tackle college tuition costs, and I understand the importance of free college. So my question is, let's say hypothetically, whether these three bills do pass both houses of Congress, right? And we know that Democrats are running in some Democrats have won their primary races this year, and most of them are going to enter the midterm elections. So what would you say if the Democrats do win the midterms? What are the chances that the three bills might pass? I'm sorry, rather whether the three bills might pass both houses of Congress and signed by President Trump. And two is what would it take to codify paid internships in addition to free college? Because free college is not enough for those students graduating from universities, and there are a lot of students that end up working at Starbucks and other low-paying service jobs.
Go
Thanks,
for it, Mark.
Michael. Oh yeah, thanks, Michael, for the questions and obviously for being here. Um, a couple of points in no particular order. One, I do want to address the sort of trends in state funding piece. One thing I didn't mention is there is a huge variation across states and how they're funding higher ed. Some states, do kick in a lot more than others. And part of the need for a federal solution, right, is the fact that states have such a wide variety in how they fund higher ed that relying on them alone to do this or relying on a few good actors is not enough. So some states, are basically disinvested entirely, while other states, have tried to hold the line a little bit. So really does depend on the state. Um, your question about, the movement up around bills for free college, in a world in which there's a governing moment, right? Or we have split Congress, right? Or split government, right? President, Trump is, still, his term still lasts through 2028. It's early 2026. Time doesn't fly enough. But say there's a more supportive House and Senate, next year. Unfortunately, there's no universe in which, not no universe. There are very few universes in which President Trump would sign a free college bill, right? It's just not the priority of this administration to make lives easier for students in higher ed. I think that their actions over the past few years have proven that. They view higher education as sort of antithetical to their worldview. So there's a lot that a Congress can do to stop them from doing things like cutting basic research funding from institutions. There's a lot Congress can do to prevent them from trying to dismantle the Department of Education so that there's actual oversight and running of programs that help students. I don't see a world in which President Trump, even if there was a bill passed, signed into law, it would need to be passed with a veto-proof majority in the Senate, and even the most optimistic of us doesn't think that that's probably likely at this point. That said, that doesn't mean it's not we sit on our hands over the next couple years, right? And I think I'm looking at Thomas and others in this chat that I think making sure that we are doing as much as we can to prepare for a moment when it is possible that a president would sign this into law has to be the work over the next couple years. So that means introducing it in Congress and passing it, right? Make the president veto, bills that are going to help students, right? That means ensuring that people who are potentially going to run, for that office are centering this in part of their economic justice platforms, right? I think all of that is essential to getting to the point of actually doing something in a couple years, but I don't see it happening in the next couple years.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Mark, for that. I see Julia on Stack and Cassandra, and maybe you turn what you just said into a question or longer comment, and then we'll keep going. So, Julia, please.
My question is just, I guess, why does it seems that there's like a consensus among at least the group's part of, that College for All is the bill we should be working on. I was wondering if you could talk about that vis-a-vis the other bills. And then the second question later on that is, do you feel that bill is like ready prime time? Like if we just push on it like that is the one, or do you feel like we need to make improvement?
You cut out a little bit, Julie, but I'm almost positive I got your questions. So I will say that a couple things. I think the College for All bill, both in terms of the sort of like support around it, in Congress and outside of Congress is great, right? I don't think that we need to reinvent the wheel on this. I think that Senator Sanders and many others who have pushed for that proposal have sparked a real popular movement around that bill. So I think it's great. I also think we are in the moment of um, we are not in a moment where we should dismiss any of these proposals, right? And the value that they provide, and there are different pieces of them that I think are useful, right? So, I think College for All is amazing at its, it is a powerful, simple, and I mean that in a good way, message that if you want to attend a public 2 or 4 year college, you will do so tuition free, assuming you are not, the ultra wealthy, right? I would like to, maybe think about why we need to have a sort of income cap in some of these bills. I know that there's some political compromises there. That's an open question, right? I think that's an area we should interrogate over the next couple of years. Is should we means test this sort of thing? I personally am opposed, and I understand the sort of the fight about that. Um, the Debt-Free College Act, and I'm partial, not I don't believe in that bill more than any other. I helped write it many years ago. But that's again that's kind of neither here nor there. That bill is something that does at least recognize the amount of debt that's being taken on for non-tuition costs, right? So it doesn't eliminate tuition up front. It says you will never have to borrow for college, right? You could basically pay for college with a part-time summer job. That's the sort of like ethos there, right? I think there's some value in that, right? I also think that, it's not, as it may not be as powerful, right? Messaging. I think the point is we should actually test these with real honest to goodness people. I mean, imagine that, right? That like what is both going to be at the intersection of the most transformative change in the debt-based financing system of higher ed, um, and substantively, and the thing that really animates people. I think that's where, that's in my sense of where we should go. Um, I think that the next couple years, there's going to be a genuine discussion about whether incrementalism versus big, bold goals is the way to go. I have my opinions on this, right? But that's what we should do, right? Over the next couple years. That's not the beauty, but like one of the things you have to do when you're sort of have no political power at the federal level. So I hope that answers your question.
Super helpful. We are going to move into a part of the conversation now where we take a lot of what Mark and others have said and we ask the question of like, what would it look like to build some skills, some knowledge, and some power to move things in some of the directions. So I will ask Mark for a couple ideas, but this is also open to other people to comment on as well. I do want to say one thing about our series because Mark mentioned something really important about like we have to act now. We got to be building now. One of the aims of this series is to talk about free college in a very expansive way of thinking about freedom because yes, free tuition, but also freedom from the debts that come along with like what Mark said around like housing, but also academic freedom, but also freedom from supporting state violence and all sorts of other things. Freedom to teach what you want to learn or what you want to teach, freedom to learn what you want to learn, etc. So like when we are talking about free college in this series and elsewhere, we are talking about this very expansive notion of freedom that obviously includes this economic factor that we're addressing tonight and Mark has hit on so many good points with. So I will post again in the future, how to tap into these other sessions we're going to host. But as we think about freedom, let's think expansively about freedom in this conversation and others. Um, around like what do we do, or the classic question, what is to be done? Mark, I wanted to see if you had any ideas you wanted to share. I think you gave us some really good examples and things we could tap into. Do you want to add anything else to that? Perhaps audience members want to say a couple things about what do we do. If you have specific ideas and or examples, that'd be great. But Mark, please, if you want to share anything with us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as excited to learn from you all on this question as much as for you all to hear my silly voice for much longer. But I will offer just a few thoughts, right? I think that I mentioned that for now we've seen some promising movement among states, to get us momentum and sort of policy lessons on at least tuition free college, right? So like to the extent you are willing, able, and have the the energy to advocate at the state level about why your state doesn't do what New Mexico is a low income state, right? I think that the thing that I think is impressive about they have the most expansive free college program in the country. And again, they're a relatively low income state. Like why a state, why other states are not modeling themselves after a state that is providing tuition free college for all state residents. Again, there's some rules around it, but it's incredibly expansive. Um, that can be powerful, right? I think federal lawmakers, I think for both good and bad reasons, often looking for, state examples or points of pride and say like, hey, we did this in my state. Why can't we do this everywhere? So I think don't bemoan the lack of movement at the federal level, for a lack of opportunity at the state level. While that's happening, there are a bunch of federal touch points that get us closer to free college, right? And there are, I could exhaust you all with examples of this, but right now under a Republican and House and Senate and and a Republican White House, they are debating something called the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill sounds like it has nothing to do with college affordability, but the Farm Bill governs the SNAP program, right? And if enough people are making enough noise and enough stink about the fact that the House and Senate need to reverse the fundamental cuts and the cost sharing provisions and the administrative burdens on states that were put in place last year in the Farm Bill, because that gives us the space and opportunity to build free college at the state and federal level. There's all kinds of connections you can make. The federal government is facing, I mentioned very briefly, a shortfall in the Pell Grant program, right? Having people not only yell at Congress to say, you need to not cut Pell Grants in order to meet this shortfall. This money needs to come from somewhere else outside of, limiting eligibility for folks. So we're holding people harmless. But it also means why are we relying on Pell Grants for college affordability, right? Why don't we eliminate tuition so that Pell Grants aren't this like last option for folks, right? My point is just that there's 100 different touch points every year that aren't just passing college for all that get us nominally closer or are very connected in ways we might not expect with the college affordability crisis. So, to the extent you're willing to annoy lawmakers, do it. Nothing you do is wasted.
This is super helpful. So I just want to point out and I think if other people got other tactics and ideas that Mark put on the table for us. So on the one hand, there was this really important point about advocating at the state level. I just want to add one aspect to that. There's a really good book by Chloe Thurston and Emily Zackin around debt cancellation in the history of the United States. And one of the points they make is that debt cancellation usually started at the state level and then became national policy, if you trace the arc of that history. So that's a super important point to consider, along with what Mark said. I can post that book in the chat. Mark also, speaking of some elements that are in that book, Mark also said pay attention to the Farm Bill. We have this issue around SNAP, and so I think there's a lot to be attentive to. I had not thought about that. That's really interesting. The fight around Pell Grants, not just to say the Pell Grants are the end in themselves, but as a way to keep some funding alive, but then to go beyond that. So this is very helpful. Um, Michael Pan is saying Pell Grants plush tuition caps. So Michael's made this point several times in the chat around tuition caps. And maybe this is a question, and I'll get to Tiffany too, but something for us to think about. If we win, when we win College for All, where's our power or the incentives to make sure that, all the states go along with this? Um, how do we cap certain expenses? I think this is bringing up a really important point that perhaps people can talk about. Tiffany, do you want to share your point? Because I love what you're putting on the table for us here.
Yeah, we'll see if my internet will cooperate. Um, so I think just continuing to do the work that we need to support the narrative shifts. I'm really deep into that. Like even in the last decade, how much the conversation has shifted around debt, student debt, but educational debt, and the need to connect the building of the middle class through higher education. I'm thinking about like how that was a direct strike against not only Black Americans who served in the military who didn't have the same access to college after the World Wars, but also it really was a push against unionized labor and like the entire mechanism of student debt and inaccessibility ultimately feeding into this further disenfranchisement of labor and work and our time and our subjectivity. So I think that there's so much richness in empowering people to share their stories, to talk about the systems of control embedded within all forms of debt. And yeah, I'm just so excited to continue the fight with you all. So thank you for being so in it and bringing all this information, but also the feeling. It's not going to be the facts that change people. It's going to be people understanding that these issues all interconnect and intercept in ways that affect us across all dividing lines. So hopefully it's a unifying time.
Thank you, Tiffany. And Tiffany's been in this struggle for a long time, so really appreciate this comment. I just want to add one thing to what Tiffany said, and then I'm going to turn it over to Thomas, who I saw their hand go up. Um, the idea of debtor testimony is one, it's a tactic that Debt Collective has used since Occupy Wall Street. This is where debtors come together without shame to talk about the debts that we owe, how we got into debt. And, one of the messages and main takeaways from this is to let debtors know that we are not alone. There's other people that are struggling through debt. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. We're not guilty for that. And if you are interested in learning how to do a debtor assembly wherever you're at, definitely hit us up. We can talk about that. We do these all the time. And if we can't come out to do them, we can train you on how to do them. So, Tiffany, super helpful suggestion on a tactic. Thomas, you're up.
Yeah, so we are, not just trying to like think theoretically about how College for All could work, but want to sort of move towards organizing to win it. And I'm sort of thinking in, I don't know, sporting football metaphors. Like at the present moment, we are not in scoring position. And so I sort of feel like at the present moment, we're really just about moving the football down the field so that at some point in the future, we can be in scoring position. Uh, and to that end, I think the Debt Collective, in addition to doing these Jubilee schools, we're going to be starting to hold College for All organizing meetings on a monthly basis. And for those of you who want to plug in and get involved, I would love to follow up with you one-on-one, either over text or email or phone or a Zoom. I've got a couple of things I'm going to put in the chat here. The first one is for those of you who have student loans, we have a student loan survey that we're using to organize folks. And then I've also created a signal chat for folks who want to start organizing in sort of like the shoe leather manner. It's really kind of basic stuff, nothing too flashy or original, really, but it's the kind of thing that needs to happen if we're going to win College for All. Like, getting a dozen people in your neighborhood to hold an in-person meeting with your member of Congress or their staff to talk about College for All and find out where they stand on the issue. Again, not to say that the current version of the legislation is perfect or ideal or what we would do if we were to do something, but it's to sort of build that base of support so that at some point in the future, we can win something. Um, and yeah, if Julia, I think Julia's still here. If you have thoughts, great. I see Michael. I'll follow up with you. Uh, I feel like I'm leaving some things out that I should say, but I'm that's basically it. I want to provide a space where if you want to do more than uh, as fascinated as I am to like learn about the dynamics of the issue, like I didn't know a lot of the dynamics between SNAP and state funding and higher ed funding. Um, but I personally feel kind of depressed when I learn stuff like that without having something I can do about it. And so I think we're really um, figuring this out as we go with everything that we do. But the idea here is that we should be actually doing things. And if that's just meeting with people and talking with people and seeing where our allies are and where the resistance is, um, I feel like that's a good way to get started. So if you're interested, join that Signal chat and we'll follow up there. And yeah.
So we just
Yeah,
got
please join.
go for it, Julia. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, please join us. We're gonna be working on College for All through the next year, including the midterm elections. We are a 501(c)(3), but 501(c)(3)s are allowed to advocate for specific bills, and we want to, train ourselves to go meet candidates and push them on these issues, ask them about these issues. I know somebody said something about a survey for candidates. Thomas is working with a lot of our partners to do things like that. We'll be talking more about the bill and the history, how we got here in Jubilee School. So I hope you'll continue to join us. And we also want to teach people. We also want, like Mark said, to focus at some local levels. So we want to figure out where we have people. So anyway, yes, please join us. I think there's a lot of room to get involved at kind of easy levels and also more advanced levels. So please do join, and we're excited to be working on this.
Yeah, and I listed them in the chat, some of the ideas that Thomas put out. So the student loan survey, Signal chat for organizing. There's ways to train to meet with Congress members to talk about this. I'll post right now once more how to sign up for future College for All Jubilee School sessions. One other thing I'll add is that we regularly are in conversation with higher education labor groups to talk about how do we build power with labor. We talk to the American Association of University Professors because we know that we need to be working with the people that are deeply impacted by this crisis, meaning the workers, students themselves. So if you are in a union, please consider bringing this issue up with your union. And if you want to talk about how to talk about that with union members, we can definitely walk you through that step as well. Um, do other people have any other ideas about tactics or questions? Yeah, Michael, I see your hand up. Go for it.
Yes, I just want to add, yes, before I get to the tactics, just definitely want to address Tiffany Conyan's comments very quickly. Yes, that's true that in the past, foundational Black Americans were excluded from the GI Bill after serving World War II. And yes, it's true that although free public education is necessary to eliminate the student loan debt for foundational Black Americans, but it's not enough because if you understand the country's history, if you understand America's history, wealth was stolen from foundational Black Americans. So in order for tuition debt-free public education to be effective, it needs to be paired with, I know it might sound a little crazy for some of you guys, but please understand, I'm about to say, so tuition-free public education definitely needs to be paired with lineage-based cash payment reparations for American freedmen of chattel slavery. And what do I mean by lineage-based cash payment reparations? It's for those who can identified based on the 1870 census of their lineage, where chattel slavery happened on American soil. And the reason why lineage-based reparations has to be paired because if you do free tuition or say the New Deal, right? The New Deal excluded foundational Black Americans from its program by design, and it doesn't address the racial wealth gap because other groups of people had a 400 years head start, and foundational Black Americans had a 400 years lag. And just doing tuition alone, what happens if we do free tuition, then foundational Black Americans get excluded, and then what is their plan B? So it has to be, free college and lineage-based reparation. So in other words, what I'm saying is that both are needed and understand the context behind it because what happened was when Bernie Sanders was asked about reparations in 2016, he was very hostile, not understanding, and pretty much you could say biased and said universal programs or universal policies would help people of color. But saying people of color does not necessarily mean it's going to help foundational Black Americans. So that's why the details and specificity are very important. Anyways, sorry to digress. I know it might have been very sensitive for you guys, but I just want you guys to understand where foundational Black Americans are coming from. They're not against free college tuition. What they're saying is that free tuition is not enough to close the racial wealth gap because universal programs like free tuition, yes, moves the country forward, but lineage-based cash-paying reparations corrects, I mean, correct, cor correct America's past. So anyway, so
Yeah.
my question is, we know at the Fed, thank you. I hope you guys are not too upset because I know this is very sensitive. Anyways, just wanted to digress. So my question is this, right? We know at the federal level, it's going to be tough to get free college education to the finish line. What Thomas said earlier, especially when we're still stuck on the 50-yard line. We can't even get closer to the end zone. So my thing is this. I think we need to do is let's get something more transformative. What I mean by more transformative, going beyond incremental changes, but getting closer to free tuition, either at the federal or state level. And my question is that some states have a balanced budget requirements that don't allow institutions of higher learning to offer free tuition. And do you think that the balanced budget amendment at the state level either needs to be ratified or at least it needs to be eliminated to go for assembly vote? Because we definitely want to see
Great
free
question.
tuition. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great. And maybe Mark, I don't know if Mark, if you know much about that, and then we'll talk about the question that I would frame as an abolitionist possession question in a second. But Mark, do you have knowledge about that or anyone else on the call? That's a good question, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean at the state, I'd say two points to that. One sort of a cop out on the state budget piece. I mean, there are states that have balanced budget, requirements, right? And that limits them from being so expansive in anything, right? And free college being one example. And so that's, my cop out answer is that's why we need to continually focus on the federal solution, not just because of scale, right? Because it should be an American promise that anyone can enter higher ed or get the training they need without, having to take on debt or do it free of charge. But because, states are often constrained, right? I think tactics at the state level, making sure that you're, doing what you can to create as much budget flexibility as possible, right? So that could take the form of, advocating for ending balanced budget amendments, right? That could take the form of taxation, right? Saying like, well,
Right.
if we have to balance the budget, what are our priorities, right?
Mm.
Wealth taxes at the state level, right? Massachusetts has a proposal to fund, a debt-free college plan through a wealth tax, right? So, and it's going to look different in every state, right? Depending on the resources, depending on the people, depending on the revenue, right? So, I think that's the nice thing is you can attack this a few different ways. So that would be my answer.
Right.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
One
because
sec, Michael,
oh,
just one
sorry.
second. I want to just to make
Yeah.
a quick connections here. really important, my friends, that one of the things we're going to have with the Jubilee School is we're going to have sessions that
Mhm.
address some of these points that Michael's brought up around, like what does it look like to create a system that tries to repair for some of the wrongs done, especially when they were wrongs done in the name of the university. So a lot of people on this call know that some of the first universities were funded through dispossession of indigenous lands and slave labor, selling slaves, etc. So what would it look like to address those concerns, those reparations in the fight that we're talking about? Michael just, or not Michael, sorry, Mark just brought up this issue of like, what does it look like on the state level? And we are going to have a presentation from the president of the Massachusetts Teacher Association, Max Page, who's going to talk about how they won taxing the rich in Massachusetts and what that's meant for their education budget, not just at the higher ed level, but also at the K through 12 level. So we are really trying to do this comprehensive study of what it looks like to think about free college in the most expansive way possible. Um, I want to start to wrap up. Michael, we hope you come back to future sessions to get into some of this stuff, but I wanted to just allow Mark to have a last word or two, and then we'll wind things down. Um, Mark, you got anything you want to add to this? I mean, it's been great.
I, I don't know. I'll just reiterate that I'm so thrilled that y'all are doing this. I'm so thrilled that you're doing it, to your points, Jason, in the most expansive way possible, right? Because the way, not only the way that we build a system that makes sense and is fair and is reparative, right? Um, is to get as many people involved in the fight as possible. And that includes the workers, right? That includes people who care about, basic issues of equity and taxing the rich, right? And making the rich pay their fair share. People who care about, again, American history, right? I think, there's so much of that that, frankly has been missing from some of the free college conversations thus far, right? It's been about, literally the narrow blocking and tackling of what a federal state partnership looks like, right? So building this sort of movement, I think is so crucial. Um, and I think, bringing in, everybody's possible is the best thing. I will say the elephant in the room, and this, I don't know, this is not a good last word to end on, but one of the real political and policy sometimes helpers and sometimes impediments is colleges themselves. And I think
Mhm.
we need to make sure some of the lessons we learned from 2014, 15, 16, 2020, 2021, in the early years of the Biden administration was the ways that colleges have their own incentives, even public ones, right? Even ones that need more funding, and what they're willing to fight for and what they're not willing to fight for. We've learned that in the Trump administration over the past couple years. So figuring out how we're both supportive of massive new investments in higher ed while dealing with the politics of colleges themselves, I think is going to be crucial, and I'm sure will be talked about in your series. So, so excited and so thankful that y'all have me here.
Thank you. And that's actually a really important point to end on, Mark. Thank you for adding that. Thomas, I see your hand up, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, I know we are trying to wrap things up, but Mark, I just want to ask you directly, how can we win over universities? Because this has been something I've been puzzling about for a long time, thinking we really should all be rowing in the same direction. And although I've read the histories of why they've opposed it at various points of time, including most recently in the Inflation Reduction Act, some college lobbyists lobbied against college funding. Um, but it seems like there should be avenues to get them on board. And do you have some good ideas of how we could do that?
Um, God, if I had the full swath of solutions, I wish I did. But I think there's a couple dynamics at play. One is that I think if we've learned anything over the past year or two, it's that I say this not lightly, um, and do not say this often, but learning lessons from what this administration has, the orientation they've taken towards colleges and universities, which is we don't care if you stand in our way, we're going to, massively cut your funding, to little or no, not to a pretty meek fight, right? Like the existential threats that higher ed has faced over the past few years has not been matched with a very strong fight from colleges themselves. So I think if you turn that on its head, right, and you say, look, we have dealt with situations where colleges have sort of annoyingly opposed free college in some ways because it's funding but with constraints, right? It's funding with requirements. What they want is funding with no requirements, right? In many cases. I mean, we all want it. We all want money with no strings attached, right? Um, Understanding that there have been like we are on the sort of right side here and we're saying, look, we're going to put constraints on it whether you like it or not, and sort of pushing through some of the opposition and encouraging lawmakers to push through some of the opposition. Um, because they did it before with massive cuts. I don't know why we can't do that with actual funding for it. That's more of a dynamic and an orientation that I want to think about. I think that lawmakers have been very scared of colleges for a long time, and I think the last couple of years proves you don't actually have to be. Um, that's my short answer. The second answer is like colleges are beholden often to the sort of trade associations that govern them. And I work with some of these folks all the time, the American Council on Education or the associations of land grant universities and things like that. And sometimes they do good work, right? But often they're a lobby, right? And they lobby for certain things. Having individual college leaders be the ones speak out for this and not the associations is often, more effective than trying to get the groups of them on board.
Super
Can I
helpful.
say one thing on that from the CFPB point of view?
Please.
Sorry.
CFPB means, can you tell everybody?
Yes, sorry. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a federal agency I worked at, and did student loan policy and had a lot of fights with universities, colleges about their non-compliance with federal consumer laws. I also think it's important. One thing I've learned over the past couple of years with the Trump administration's relationship with universities is that universities are, I think, so scared of the Trump administration that they are more compliant with the laws that we were mad at them about at this time. So, for example, offering loans that were too punitive or had fees that were out of compliance with the law. I think if I guess all of that to say, I think it's okay for the government to lean on public institutions to follow laws. And I think in some ways we just need to ask our elected officials to like hold colleges to normal standards. I think the lobbying groups, I completely agree with your point, Mark, on the lobbying groups. And I think, for example, as Doha Meki will talk about in a couple sessions, like colleges, I think are breaking like price fixing law as well. I think it's important just to see universities as the conglomerates they are in certain cases and call them that as opposed to treating them as people who have to be friends in the fight at all times. I think it's okay if they're breaking the law for us to say they're breaking the law. That's all.
Thank you, Julia, coming from all sorts of experience in the trenches. Before we leave, the next sessions I just posted, next week, Julia and I will be talking about how we got into the crisis that we're in. On the March 26th, we'll hear from Doha Meki around tuition pricing. 416, Michael will get into some of the questions and issues that you brought up around reparations, the dark history of university past, and how the academy or the university still takes too much from our communities without giving back. 423, we'll hear from Higher Education Labor United, which is a coalition of labor unions from across the country that has come together to say labor unions in higher ed have to fight for what we're talking about here. And we need to make sure that working conditions within the free college that we win are just for all workers and all workers, not just tenured faculty, but all workers. And then on 5-7, we'll hear from Charlie Eaton on who runs the university and why is it run in such a plutocratic way. From there, we'll move into even more sessions about what the new university will look like and how we win it. Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up. We hope to see you on future sessions. We'll continue to build knowledge. We'll continue to build some tactics. And together we build power to win.
And just so
Thank
you
you,
know,
Mark,
Mark
once more.
Hulsman will absolutely be back. So shout out to Mark for coming for one more session, which will be what is it, Mark? It's about the history of the College for All fight specifically,
Yeah.
right,
Nice.
Mark? Like that specific bill. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Um,
and like state or
and
we're
some
going to
of
talk
the
about like
state programs.
state
So
stuff. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, which would be great.
Thank you, everybody. Hang in there. We're going to win. Good night.
Good night.